Oh, running late. Wow, not many people here today. Let's see what we got. Everybody signed into the document. I don't see any new faces. Javier, you want to talk about any release planning?
Yeah, I could speak for Emily, who's not here as well. From what I recall, there is a release for Lifecycle that is planned for the end of this week. I think the hope is to try to get it out tomorrow, but if not, Friday. Other than that, there is a scheduled CCB or Code Freeze Feature Complete for PAC on Tuesday. So again, if there are any issues or PRs you want to get in before that point in time, please do so now. I don't know, Natalie or Yael, if you have more insight into the release for Lifecycle and what all it entails.
Um, yeah, Emily gave us a bit of a rundown yesterday or the day before. There's a handful of issues that we'd like to, do work on before the next release. I believe she's targeting this week for that.
And then if I remember correctly, I think the latest Buildpack API version is what's going to be supported, which is, I believe, is Buildpack 04. So yeah, I think that might impact some Buildpack authors. At least they could take advantage of newer functionality that way. But it should still be backwards compatible with Buildpack API 03.
Great. You want to have anything else? No? Okay, let us begin the great RFC rundown. Which one do I want? It's this one. Safari pull requests. That sounds right. RFC to drafts, offline build packages, RFC. I'm guessing this is who's in control of this now.
This would be Dan. Last I heard, there are still conversations being done. I don't know if there's been any real updates to the RFC itself, but progress is being made, at least through conversation.
Sounds good. Applications, Joe's unlikely to be here to talk for that. Terrence, you have any input on application mix-ins and whether it's moving?
I know he's working on the stack pack stuff with Emily, just working on kind of POC implementation of it.
Okay.
And then cursing Go a lot is what I've heard in the leadership room.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a pretty common from Java developers who like having, functionality in their languages. Okay. Experimental features. Same from him. This one, last time this was touched was 6 days ago, but it sounds like Joe's going to have to answer for that. Pack subcommands.
I don't think I've seen a lot of movement here as far as questions or anything else. I've updated it, so my hope is to get people to review it. If not, I guess I could start poking people.
Yeah, it's the only thing that's contentious is like space.
I don't think.
Is that right, Javier?
I don't even think that was very like there was a lot of argument there. Based on our last working group meeting, if we feel like that is still something that we need to discuss, I guess we could bring it up when there are more people available.
Well, I'm just trying to. I remember from the last working group, like there was a set of things that were talked about, but I feel like
yeah, and I think I addressed all of
resolution.
them. Yeah, the resolution was ultimately to go with the lowest level of effort, which is to keep the space denotation. But yeah, again, if anybody feels strongly, then we should definitely be having those conversations.
Yeah, so it seems like, was that 8 days ago? So I'm not sure if Yael's on the call, but you and you should vote along with you, Terrence, Joe. I'll bang on Stephen a little bit to make sure he does his as well.
Yeah, I should also ping Travis to vote on this.
Yeah.
Just because it's a pack thing for platform.
Great. He has now been notified that his presence is requested.
And Steven is here.
Hey, Stephen.
Hey.
Experiment. Oh, nope. We already passed experimental features. Pack subcommands would like a vote from you. Do you have any outstanding questions about it?
Nope. I will go add that.
Okay. Layer origin metadata is drafted. Project or scripter flexibility. Is this Joe again? No, this is you. Terrence.
Yeah, I think I heard there was some discussion that I wasn't here for last week in relation to Josh's RFC from the schema stuff. But
okay.
maybe let's just talk about it after the RFC review a little bit for a few minutes.
Okay, sounds good. Just want to make sure it's moving along in a way that you are happy with, or if you would like to demand people review at this time. Any stack build packs? This is you, Stephen, right?
Yep. This just needs approvals from people, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I think I opened, or I had just a question around kind of the default. Well, I made that comment earlier today, but
yeah. That seems like it just needs a response more. We're good to go there. Almost everything else has made it into FCP. Shell-free profile D.
Yep. This one needs more discussion. Someone, I forget who it was, someone in there pointed out that the N format that we were going to use doesn't support new lines at all. Works for everything except for new lines. No special character problems or anything else except new lines, because that's the one separator they use to define the thing. So I listed some options at the bottom, and I put it on the agenda so we can talk about it.
Okay, let's talk about that in the agenda then. That is it. Next item in the agenda, exec D. Go ahead, Stephen. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So everything seemed pretty good, and then at the last minute, I think it wasn't someone from GitLab, it was maybe someone from Google chimed in and said, "Hey, wait a second, I don't think this actually works." Vin Vaki, whoever that is. So I listed 5 options down there. One is we could just not support new lines. I don't think that's a good idea. One is we could come up with a different way of encoding new lines, because it really is just this one problem. It's not like a general special character problem. It's like new lines are the problem. That seems pretty weird, though. I don't want to invent a new format. We could use TOML, and maybe instead of using your key equals value equals format, because it's all supposed to be machine readable, we just use TOML as the way to specify keys and values. It would look just like environment variables, but with TOML doing managing escaping, and you can use TOML libraries. Disadvantage there is that you're using the TOML parser during launch, right? So if you're using like burnt sushi and it does a lot of weird reflection, it may add a couple extra milliseconds to launch time. I don't think it's really a big concern, especially because it's flat list, right? There's not a lot of deep nested structure in there. We could benchmark it. I'm not actually worried about it. I just thought I'd call it out.
Can we define a schema to disallow basically inline tables or something?
Well, this is going to be a flat list of environment variables that go straight to another process. So anything that is not literally key equals string value is invalid. So like, yes, very simple schema.
Okay.
We can make sure the launcher doesn't refuses to parse anything that's not literally string. The next two options are maybe slightly more standard, but also kind of more exotic. Like Bash actually has a format, and there's even a POSIX standard format, sort of, for listing environment variables like this, kind of. That's you can use export-p, and it'll output something that in Bash 5 plus usually doesn't have any problems. Before Bash like 4.4 though, there are a bunch of issues with it, and it doesn't actually work with some characters. So I gave some options there in 4 and 5. Didn't really recommend either of them. That's pretty weird, especially because we don't have Bash here and can't really parse that anyways. Like, you'd have to write a manual parser for this stuff for the use cases we care about it for. So I'm not very partial to those. So I think TOML is pretty good. There's one option that the guy from GitLab mentioned. I forget where he mentioned it. It might have been over Slack. We could chain them together. So we could have each exec responsible, like you could pass each exec the next exec in the chain, and hope that they correctly exec, meaning the syscall exec, like exec v or whatever, the next process with the right arguments. It would be especially difficult for the last one, but then you'd have the inherited environment going all the way through. That's kind of tempting because I could see the perfect behavior for preserving environment variables, but it's also like putting a lot of trust that each author of each exec script is really going to execute the next process perfectly. And so it's a good idea, but I'm pretty skeptical. I feel like it's a little risky. Ben, you're muted.
I had a well-written comment that basically said, hey, like, this is a giant pain in the ass, because imagine you've got a bash build pack and you're trying to generate TOML as output. And I'm like, oh yeah, he can't execute that kind of build pack here, so I guess that doesn't matter. Like, I'm surprised you don't like 4, right? Like, the life cycle should be able to parse that relatively easily. It's intuitive. Like, to be bluntly honest with you, I am surprised to hear that 4 just doesn't work, right? Like, it's exactly what you'd expect it to be. So like, that feels like something we have the ability to write, or to parse nicely, and reflects what I think the instinct of contributors of environment variables would do. In fact, I believe this is like sort of all the places we do this kind of thing. We literally write out that kind of output. It is all single line, admittedly, which then just gets wedged into an eval statement in a lot of places.
So we don't have a shell to eval this.
Sure, no, agreed. But like, you writing a parser for that, like, it's not the most complex thing I've ever seen.
I don't know how well this format's defined. And I think the stuff between the quotes, there's a bunch of weird escapey things you have to do for special characters that aren't like this example is a simple example, but it's not.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like it was enough of a standard. I was really hopeful about it for the same reasons. Like, even if you're not going to shell parse that, even if export and declare are literally meaningless commands you're going to stick in front of each line for no reason. Like, I even thought, can we strip out the export or the declare -x and declare the format to be like thing equals thing, but then that middle format, it just varies. How you escape the middle thing varies between versions of Bash tremendously. For 3, they're different escapes, and it doesn't work completely. For 4 plus, it works, but it's very complicated. It started to seem like it wasn't worth it.
Is it not worthwhile? Like, yeah, okay. And so the TOML representation of the same kind of thing basically looks exactly like that, except without the word export in front of it, doesn't it?
Yep, and the inside of the quotes has very standard, well-defined, ways of escaping characters, because TOML has a spec, unlike Bash inside of thing, and so it basically gets you that. That's kind of the thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Spring Boot team recently had to describe the syntax of a file that they needed internally that was going to be a list of things, and they described a syntax. It was effectively a subset of YAML so that they could use a YAML parser if they had one available to them. And so like, I'm not sure we should particularly define it as this is a subset of TOML, but we can describe a syntax here that is in effect a subset of TOML so that you do have some convenience if you want to use it.
That's pretty good. I don't think you need a TOML parser in order to output it or to read it if you really didn't want to use one.
Yeah, agreed.
TOML will allow quoted keys. That's the only thing. But again, if this is a subset, if we say you're not allowed to use quoted keys when you output it, then,
Yeah, and I think that's why the boot team did that particular thing, rather than say this file should be a YAML array. They said a file needs to start with a dash, have a space, and then blah, 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 whatever it is. And I think even if we sort of think of it as a subset of TOML, we should define it in the same way, right? Like whatever the character set, and then an equal sign, potentially with white space on either side, and then the rest potentially quoted, right?
Yep.
Like, and then that gives us the ability to be a bit more specific, and then use tooling that happens to understand that subset.
That sounds great. So subset of TOML such that the key names are unquoted valid environment variables and the values are double quoted, values that they can't be single quoted or use TOML's other notation for literal strings.
Yep.
No, I don't know about multi-line TOML. To think about what multi-line TOML looks like. I think it's okay. Cool. So that's exec-D. Were there any questions on the other? I know I opened a ton of RFCs at the beginning of the week. Everything is in FCP, but Terrence, I wanted to make sure that you got a chance to review everything, because I know you were out last week.
I think I read most of the stuff that you've basically dropped in the last week, like 7 RFCs or something.
And you, I believe,
five
out of all that, you responded to 2 of them. So, Stephen, keep an eye out for those notifications.
Yeah, I guess probably the one I had the strongest opinion on was the AnyStack Buildpack one, and so I want to just talk about that. And that was, I think I definitely want this functionality, but I'm curious if we want the default to not be assuming it is AnyStack if it's empty.
I'm very torn on this also. It's like
yeah, I guess like I don't know, like there's definitely a lot of use cases I can think of wanting this feature. So I'm definitely for it. But I wonder, like I think Ben was the one that made the comment about kind of having to opt into it. And I'm wondering what brainstorming from last week there was on, is there like a middle ground here that makes sense for opting into it versus just turning this on by default for everyone?
Yeah, like one of the questions I actually have for you, Stephen, and I don't have a good grip on this, is like, how realistic do we think it is that a build pack in any stack build pack truly is any stack, could run both on a Linux and a Windows stack?
I think there are 2 questions in there. In reverse order, because I think the answer to your question helps answer Terrence's question. A statically compiled Go binary, right, that includes libmusl in it, is going to run on any Linux.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'd have
that.
A build pack that's bash script that only uses bash built-ins, right?
Yeah.
Probably going to, complies as POSIX compliant. It's probably going to run on a very large number of stack images, right?
Yeah.
Especially because shells are almost always in the build images.
Yeah.
So,
but that's not any stack.
Yeah, but it's close enough that if you have a build time failure because it doesn't run, then...
Sorry. No. By that, I mean, that's not Windows stacks, right? You just described
sure.
any Linux, right? Not any.
Yeah. So, okay. So that's a different problem. That's actually, I was very worried about that and thought we need to introduce another key for operating system, but you can't actually start that build because the build pack is going to be in the build package format for Windows. It's not the build package format for Linux. So you wouldn't be able to get the build pack onto the image anyways. So I was very worried about that. But sorry.
Is the build package format for Windows specified anywhere? Like in a distribution spec or anything?
Great question for.
I don't believe it is.
Okay. This was the first I heard the statement, it is not the same build package. And I'm like, oh, okay. I'd like to read about that then.
That makes sense. It can't be. It can't be the same build package because the pads are all Unix style pads, and it's a Linux layer, right? It wasn't like an explicit decision not to be non-standard. It was a needs driven, you know.
Yeah. I'm interested to know what that is. Like if I wanted to start creating Windows build packs today, I'm interested in it. But anyway, continue along. So there you go.
And so given that it's not operating system constrained, we're just talking about Linux build packs being able to float between different stacks, right? It doesn't worry me too much to just allow build packs to say, whatever, just try to run me. If it fails during build, that's okay. And the best UX for that, in my head, given what we have, is like leave the list empty, right? The list is a list of restrictions. If you don't have any restrictions, it runs on everything. That feels like it's a very good design sort of what it looks like, as opposed to introducing a random bool that says, if this list is empty, don't fail. That seems like a weird thing to do. At the same time, I could totally see people just saying, build pack toml. It doesn't work if the file's empty. Here's an ID. It doesn't work if the version's empty. Here's a version. Oh, my build pack works now. I'm going to ship it. And then it doesn't work and everything. But at that point, like, didn't you kind of make this thing with the idea that, you kind of wanted it to just work on things? And if it fails during build, then, that's kind of your fault. It's like, as a build pack author, you kind of shot yourself in the foot there. You're not going to do a good job of making sure your build pack is perfectly compliant with whatever stacks you've selected anyways. Like, I'm not
like,
totally convinced that it's.
Yeah,
sorry.
like we all claim to be compliant with Bionic, but like I don't know what Heroku's Bionic stack actually looks like and whether it works until somebody actually goes off and runs it and opens a bug and says, hey, this doesn't actually work. Right? Like we're doing the best we can.
I mean, I do wonder.
Go ahead, Javier.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I do wonder if the need for ID is really there, right? Like, if you think about mixins, like you would think about labels and any sort of like resource-driven system, like the mixin or the label would help you better narrow down what the compatibility is for said resource. So like ultimately what I'm thinking is I'd like to be able to specify, stacks without having to specify a very specific ID, but still be able to provide labels or mixins that say, Windows, for the lack of a better example, right? Or Linux or some other arbitrary, convention that the community comes up with that then signifies the same thing that it would as operating system, right? But without being specific to that nomenclature.
I think that's what we were trying to do with, there was an RFC a while back about making stack IDs not specific, right? Instead of there being a stack ID for the Heroku version of Bionic or the CF version of Bionic, there's an RFC where we said the project will define IO build pack stacks Bionic as anybody who's going to use a Bionic-based stack that's derived from Ubuntu Bionic should use the same stack ID. And so it doesn't create fragmentation in the ecosystem. And the reason why I think it's important to at least differentiate very clearly at Bionic versus Focal versus whatever is they all have different ABI. So if you ask for, lib anything, image magic, any library, the ABI is going to change between Bionic and Focal and change potentially drastically between those and, however it's built for UBI. And so, being able to say, the binaries I'm going to install are linked against this level of compatible library, right? Or being able to specify a mixin that's, libc++ or ImageMagick or whatever that code will actually link to when you install it seems like really important so that things aren't just horribly broken when you try to run them.
Yeah. And
so,
because the mix-in syntax is like semantically, like as we discussed in previous meetings, is semantically adjacent to the actual stack ID itself, right? We've designed Bionics mix-ins to be package names, but not all stacks would design mix-ins the same way. Like I think it sort of acts as a first level selector, right? Similar to your, Linux or Windows, and then underneath it you can describe actually what you need to run given that sort of core screen selector.
Right. So what if, I hear a couple concerns, like if we were to leave stacks completely gone, right? Which it means that people might not add it and inadvertently create something that now assumes can be run on any system. What if we actually left the key and then for ID did something like an asterisk, right? Like a special character or special token that signifies I explicitly say that this could run on any stack, right? And then you could still leverage mixins for whatever they may mean for the specific stacks that you have in mind, to be able to actually run this with.
Would you be able to
What does that
specify?
mean? What was that magic character mean when combined with another stack ID? What does star, comma, the Bionic ID in the same stack array mean at that point? Does it mean star minus this, star plus this, which is star again? Does it matter what order they're in?
Maybe it means when you use this other stack ID, these are the mixins you need to have with it. But if you don't, if you're not using that stack ID and you, if you're not using that stack ID that's specified, then it'll still try to run. It just won't do any validation. And then mixins is not allowed probably with star, because then you get into this problem of like the mixin names mean different things on the different stacks.
So it's a fine graining, a specifying of for a particular stack, this has this additional behavior.
Maybe a
additional requirement.
Yeah, but maybe a clear way to do it is a Boolean that instead of is like any stack, the Boolean is like skip validation. Like skip validation when the stack ID isn't present. Try to run this anyways. If the unknown stack ID is there, don't.
The advantage of Javier's star suggestion, or whoever came up with sort of an opt-in, but the star one specifically is appealing because my memory of stack declarations in Buildpacks is as an allow list, right? Like you put in the things you want to run against. So an empty one in the old way of thinking about it means I run against nothing, versus having a wild card all of a sudden says I do run against something. And you could imagine something like io.buildpacks.ubuntu.star, right? Because I actually want to, like, all of the Ubuntu related ones actually describe stack mixins in the exact same syntax. Like, this might be enough.
Yeah, that was Ben hit kind of the comment I was going to make. I guess when I interrupted Javier was, it is an allow list. And so this changes it. This changes kind of, I guess, the original definition, which was also why I was thinking about that. But I didn't think about the Ubuntu star thing. That's pretty interesting.
Maybe this actually, instead of saying any stack build packs, what we should actually be saying is wild carded stack IDs.
So that starts to scare me, because then you can do things like say, I want image magic, right? I want some C library, but I'm okay with any ABI, like with different ABIs, right, of that same library, and on the hope that, or like you're kind of hoping for something to happen, but the result you get is pretty bad, which is that whatever you install probably only works with one of them, right? Because you've built a binary against.
But so I don't think this changes sort of like rebase behavior. Once an image has been created, right? You can only rebase that image off of the concrete stack ID you'd originally chosen.
Sure, but during the build process, how your build pack is still going to have this problem where it needs to select the right binary that was built against the right version of image magic for the stack ID.
Oh, I don't think that's necessarily true, right? Like, as long as you could imagine like compiling against it locally, right? Like as part of your build phase, it just needs to link against it once. And then you're guaranteed ABI compatible against the thing you just linked against, right? And if you care more, you can say, here is exactly the concrete version of a particular version of Ubuntu that I want.
I guess to me, like if you really want to do that, you would just, in kind of the current RFC proposal, you just leave the list empty, versus like what Ben is saying, right? And so you still run into the exact same problem you're talking about, right, Stephen?
Yeah, but I'm worried about an interface. I'm worried about creating an interface where people can do something that looks like it should work, right? That looks like they're adding just the right level of validation. And then when they actually try to use it, it has unexpected gotchas, if that makes sense. I'm fine with adding star as an option, and then for this RFC, and then expanding on it in the future to allow for wildcard matching. If the wildcard matching were something like, you could guarantee that this will only run on Ubuntu-based stacks, right? Where that are part of the IO Buildpacks Bionic project, where all of the mixins are defined in this very particular way, right? If there were a way to constrain it to that, I think I'd be okay with it. Like, because it is talking about build time validation, Ben, as you point out, it makes me nervous, but doesn't make me nervous enough to push back on it. So generally okay with that. I would want more constraints than just arbitrary wildcard matching on stack ID. I think it need to be like IO build packs, stacks, star, kind of like thing.
Yeah, that may want to make us want to, for example, repurpose. I totally blanked on what it's called. Currently, it's called IO Buildpack Stacks Bionic, right? And so like anything you'd wildcard would be IO Buildpack Stacks, right? And so it may mean that we actually need it to be IO Buildpack Stacks Ubuntu Bionic, Ubuntu Focal, and then IO Buildpack Stacks rel, whatever the hell rel calls their releases, kind of thing, to help with that.
Or introduce a class, another string field that represents the, type of distribution or something like that.
But we could just define
that class.
I mean, based on the spec, can't we just define a stack that is like Ubuntu that is that star or something, in theory?
It is that. Oh, like you could literally define IO Buildpack stacks.
Ubuntu?
Ubuntu.
Yeah.
If we want to make that available, right? Like, I think the benefit of potentially not having to change your current RFC a ton, it's like, as a project, we can define what these what wildcards we want.
IO Buildpack stacks Ubuntu would be a stack ID that you would want to put on both IO Buildpack on a run image that has IO Buildpack stacks Bionic on it too, so it still validates. That would require a lot more changes. Like you'd have this concept of multiple stack IDs on an image that are compatible, and then you have to match certain ones up in certain cases and other ones up in other cases. But I think the general, we're talking about UX for the next generation version of it. I feel like maybe it's good enough now to say like, okay, we'll allow star as a value, and then nothing else for now. No mix-in specified with star, and then we can.
I wanted to make an argument for that last piece. Like, I think there is value to be able to have mix-ins with a star. And I'm thinking more specifically for a scenario where, you could think about enterprise and they're controlling both the builders, the stacks, and the build packs themselves. And they have different people that are in charge of the different aspects of it, where they're just creating the stacks themselves, and then another set of people that are creating build packs, or even, as part of Project Tomo, you could import local build packs. And at that point, that there's a certain convention to the mix-ins, as, kind of going back to what labels are. And ultimately, I wanted to apply to any build pack, any builder or any stack, because these are the ones that I'm allowed to use. And I don't want to have to keep updating this list of available stack IDs, right? Like, I don't want to have to coordinate that effort between two individual teams. And I feel like it goes back to that philosophy, right, of allowing it to be open and really only tightening it down when we feel like there's a real need for it. And this one doesn't feel like there's a real need to put in that restriction.
I think the problem I have with that, with allowing the star to specify mix-ins afterwards, is that if you say your build pack supports star, and then you say it supports a mix-in name. That mix-in name can mean something completely different on a stack that's not related to the IO build packs, build packs IO project. So like you could say this supports star and image magic, and that makes perfect sense on all the Ubuntu stacks where image magic means the Ubuntu package image magic, but that could mean something totally different on a stack that's not defined by the project, where we've said that Ubuntu package names are what mixins are defined as. It seems like mixins are namespaced under each stack, and it's like it lets you break out of that namespace but keep the thing that's inside of the namespace as a match, and that seems like it's weird.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm in this scenario or this environment where that's the functionality that I want, right? Like I want to be able to use this mixin as an arbitrary label, not so much to mean anything specific to any stack outside of the ones that I have and use as part of the contract for my employment. Right.
That's another concept.
Like my domain, right?
Maybe that's another concept though. Like it seems like that's like you're consuming build packs and stacks, and you're trying to match them up. Maybe that's not how we want to use mixins. But I probably don't understand what you're proposing completely. I like the scenario you described.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure we could refine it further. Yeah, obviously we could iterate on it, and this would be a really good step forward nonetheless.
Yeah. So my vote is for now basically to introduce the first wildcard, right? Star, and then see how wildcards work out, and then a subsequent RFC 6 months from now that says, oh, we should actually have wildcards in other ways as well, so that we can select all Ubuntu's or all Rels or all whatever later on. But I don't think it's required. Like, this is the first step in a concept, and we can enlarge that concept in the future if it's appropriate.
What does star mean? We talked about Windows containers. It just doesn't apply, or I felt like we were talking about that before, right?
It applies, but because you can't distribute a build pack that works on both Linux and Windows, it's kind of irrelevant, if that makes sense. It's like in the Windows context, it means any Windows stack. In the Linux context, it means any Linux stack.
So I have some concerns about that statement because like we're talking about and tying distribution to compatibility, where I don't necessarily think that that's completely true. If we talk about like the case of local build packs from Project Toml, right? You could then run that on a Windows container builder or a Linux container builder. And it doesn't know or care at that point because it's packaging it ad hoc at that point in time.
At that point, though, is it really that much different from like, oh, my local build pack doesn't work, let me just throw the stack ID in the stacks list? It's like you're talking about the build pack before it's been processed into an artifact for distribution, and so it doesn't, like, you're gonna have problems like, do all the files have the right line endings? Is everything actually executable in this environment? It seems like it's, just because there's a shortcut that'll let you build the build pack into something that it shouldn't be built into, that feels like it's maybe a different kind of problem.
Yeah. Is it a bash script or not, for example?
Right, and bash scripts would work if you have bash installed, right?
In your Windows thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
again, I'm just throwing out like depending on this, facade of distribution for the compatibility check doesn't necessarily seem like it's a very strong verification process. Not saying that I have a strong stance. I'm just saying that we should use that with caution because it is possible to fall into that scenario.
I think a way to solve that would be like your build pack has to declare what operating system, what like general, I don't know how you describe that, like types of operating systems your build pack is, defined for explicitly, instead of relying on, the line endings in your build pack toml matching the right operating system or whatever, right? Like we could make that a lot more explicit. And I think that makes sense. I don't know if this RFC needs to do it though. Right. I don't think this RFC prevents us from being able to do that in the future. definitely not opposed to introducing that. I just don't want to block on it. Cool. I thought this would be the least controversial one. That'd be like
Sorry.
I was really surprised.
Well,
It's
it's
not-
like I think we all want it. It's just coming
Yeah,
up with
it's
the
not-
proper
it's not-
syntax to get it there.
Yeah, it's not controversial. I feel like a lot of ideas aren't necessarily super controversial. It's just like what the implications are with backwards compatibility or defaults or things like that have to be thought through probably a little bit more because we are so far along in the project. I think that's like the tricky stuff.
Makes sense. I just want this so I'm still working on pack file, and you have to explicitly specify all the stacks. So we're just trying to get a syntax in there.
Yeah.
That sounds good. I'll update that to include the star. You said there, Terrence, there were two. Was there another one you wanted to be
I think
helpful to
Ben
chat
said I
about?
commented on another one. May I comment on it?
Opt-in
It was
layer
the one-
caching.
Yep, that's the one that I just did a giant paragraph worth of stuff back.
And this one, yeah. So I think the way we have it right now is like really dangerous, and that nobody like it's a big oversight in a way that like it's possible when you're writing really simple build packs to accidentally leave stuff around in the image at the end that your build pack has no information on, and that just like a simple build pack is going to not use the caching strategies and tend to rewrite stuff anyways, right? So I wasn't sure, like, I don't know, Terrence, if you wanted to talk about your.
Sure. I guess just from seeing third-party build packs, kind of on the Heroku side, like, I definitely see, like, for sure what you're saying, like there's build packs that don't do caching, and that's definitely the first iteration of it. And then it becomes probably a little more popular than they thought, and then people complain that it's slow, so they introduce some type of caching, right, to basically speed up maybe downloading, compiling something. Like I definitely seen build packs that literally, as part of the thing, literally compiled the package in the bin compile. So I guess like the name's appropriate there in the old build pack API. And then like, oh yeah, so then they like basically cache, they do the compile still because like they don't have a place to store the assets. Like we don't provide that as Heroku, for instance, right? So they'll do the compile and then they'll basically just like store it in the cache, right? The kind of compile thing, and then you can copy over at least on second and every other build after, it's at least faster. And I also understand the dangers, and I don't like for a lot of these things, I don't disagree with the changes. Like I think they are better. I'm just thinking about like for the default and it doesn't mean like my comment isn't like a blocking comment. It's just like a comment I think for discussion of like, I think we should think about this. And it's more of, okay, like, do we expect a bunch of people coming in using this thing to expect it to function this way? And maybe we do. I mean, it's just like, this is the right way to do it, and they should learn how to do this. And it also made me think like, if that's the case for some of these RFC changes, we probably want to maybe even explicitly call out like documentation or other updates we have to make. Even though like that's kind of assumed with any of these things, but this for sure feels like one of those, like, we need to be very explicit about this kind of change coming in. Yeah, I mean, I think it is like probably like if you are a build pack author who is probably not as well versed, who's thought about like, why is this thing dangerous? Like we've all, like, I feel like this change comes in because we have been doing build packs for a while, and you do think about some of these things, but I think for like a more casual build pack author who doesn't do this full time, who's just like trying to get a thing done to like move on with their life and solve a need, and they're just trying to get some optimization, it is like more complexity that you have to think about. I don't know
That
if
makes sense.
Stephen.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I definitely agree that we should be very loud about making the change and document it. I was wondering if there was an interface you thought would be more obvious. The first version of this I proposed was like rename all the directories to dot something and then force people to rename it back. Ben had a good idea that I think is just strictly an improvement over that in terms of usability, and I was hoping that would be like a good way to not make it too much of a breaking change, right? The thing that like, just to talk about the reason why I feel like it's worth it. There are a lot of scenarios where it's easy to build up a cache, like in the old build pack interface, you could build up the cache too big, right? Like you could just keep putting stuff in it as old versions of Buildpacks. That happened a lot in our previous Buildpack implementations, but it's also like, that feels like it's the Buildpack's responsibility. The dangerous thing here is this is like a weird kind of cache that's a cache that also ends up in the image, which wasn't like how Buildpacks used to work, and can affect, directly affect the environment that the image executes in. And that, like, because it's this kind of hybrid cache, realizing that made me go like, whoa, this could lead to something really bad and unexpected, or a security vulnerability, and so that's why I kind of felt strongly like it was worth it, even though it is kind of a big change. If that's kind of helpful context for like.
That's only true when launch is true, right? That ends up in the image for the cache.
It's true when launch is true, but when build's true and cache is true, it also affects the build time environment. Unlike in the previous build pack caches, which are just like, here's an empty directory, you can throw as much stuff in here. Yeah, it could get really big, but as long as you're not using the stuff that you conglomerate in there, it's not so bad. But in this case, it actually affects path and LD library path, and you could set an LD preload, right? You could do some really nasty stuff, a million versions ago that suddenly apply in the future when you upgrade your build pack to a much newer version. And that made me worry about it enough that I thought, this is kind of 1.0 blocking. Not like pushing back on your comment, just wanted to help explain why I thought it was worth bringing up and getting through, or coming up with an interface that you like for.
Cool. Go ahead.
This is an unrelated question. I wasn't sure if there are more open questions on the opt-in caching. But an unrelated question that kind of came up in a early discussion today. If I would want to, let's say, have a change to the RFC process, where as part of, let's say, merging in an RFC, it would also incorporate opening issues in the relevant repos. What would be the best way of doing that? Would that require an RFC to?
RFC.
Okay.
Definitely.
That should be a pretty, hopefully, simple and clear-cut RFC.
Yeah.
Might discourage me from opening RFCs.
Yeah. Exactly. I don't want to put extra work on management, on the core team. It's just I sometimes want to make sure that things actually are implemented, and sometimes otherwise things can fall through the cracks.
Okay, Emily shares those same thoughts and has been pushing us for doing some of those things. So having it codified is definitely in the direction the core team wants it to be in.
I'd really like to vote as a pre-vote on that RFC coming through. It says, if you are the owner of that RFC, when it gets merged, it is your responsibility to open issues. If you care about this RFC's content, you need to make sure that someone knows that it has to be implemented now.
That's fair.
I had actually one totally unrelated thing that I forgot to put on the schedule this time, so on another list ahead. Does anybody have thoughts on, sorry, was there anything else on the agenda that's appeared? Am I talking over somebody else's thing? No, okay, good. Has anybody had thoughts on image signing recently? Or looked into?
We need to have it.
Have thoughts?
There's an open issue and pack about it, right?
Yeah, it's been open for a while though.
And absolutely no one wants it to be Notary.
But I think it's kind of got to be Notary. That's the problem.
I was going to say, I think Notary is the only option right now.
That's an interesting statement. Like speaking internally inside of our company, the vibe I get is if it's Notary, we're not doing it, right? Like we'll invent our own thing, which is like not a very healthy situation to be in. But like if we added Notary support, it's unclear to me that the broader community would use that Notary support at this time.
That's, again, with the same internal head on, I'm getting the opposite signals. We should
Oh, really?
talk about, but I think from different perspectives.
Yeah.
We have a lot of people asking for image signing for things they want to build with it.
Yep, I agree.
I think the big thing we're blocked on is making a decision about should we use Notary, and then figuring out who wants to do that work. I think it has to be in the life cycle is the main. That's the hardest part. Is it's not something someone could go out and build on their own, because we need to do the signing unless we're going to pull down the image again, which kind of
defeats the purpose.
Right, exactly. We need to do the signing as we generate the manifest in the life cycle's exporter phase.
Yeah, and I'm also like, when we eventually do an RFC around that, I'd like to see an RFC written with an abstraction in place of which Notary is a single instance of it. So like flag to pass, not like a flag that says I want to sign this image, but a flag that says to sign this image, I would like to use Notary.
Yeah.
Right.
I thought maybe
because almost certainly Notary can't survive. I just can't believe it. So many people hate it so much.
Docker container trust, Docker trusted something is like it's described as a subset of Notary, or like an easier amount of Notary to use for images, or I don't know. If you read the Docker content trust website, it seemed like, maybe it was something that we implement just that workflow, and I don't know enough about it to say. Natalie, did you do or I thought somebody here did an investigation into container signing at some point. Maybe I'm confused though.
I think we gave it, a glance. I don't know that we ever went deep into it.
Why do people hate Notary so much?
Because it requires a central server. That's at least one aspect of it.
I mean, Notary is in the update framework, or two projects together that are another CNCF project, right? That we should, look deeply at and consider whether they make sense for this use case.
I believe there was also a problem with how Notary signs the wrong stuff and like makes things more brittle than it really needs to be. Things like that. Is that right?
Some things like that. It's definitely.
I don't want
controversial.
I don't want to introduce any. It just seems like there were clear negative vibes. I was as a total noob. I'd like to understand
the only
why.
positive thing I've ever heard said about Notary is it currently exists.
We are on YouTube here.
I got no problem saying that.
But there isn't another popular framework for signing images.
Yeah, it is a very, very difficult problem. Is part of the issue, right? Like they did the legwork to have something, and that something is better than nothing. But apparently, it's also not bad enough that anyone is willing to forge ahead and try and have a competing thing.
It's very complex and intended to solve some larger problems, and then signing looks like, oh, this would be a great use case for this much more complex way of sort of collecting metadata about things, or whatever the goals of TUF are, but didn't end up looking like a really simple put a signature on an image, go validate it when you pull it type thing.
I feel like I remember seeing something about, maybe Google's going to do something about it. But
John Johnson proposed something, I think, a while back. Sorry, you're right. That is a thing. But I haven't heard anything about it.
Okay, 1 o'clock.
4 o'clock. Thanks for
See ya.
All right. See y'all.